series. And I'm so happy to welcome these like 3 amazing speakers, and most of whom I've known for several years. And I'm really happy that we are all together here and that you were able to come and join us for this event. So I will first give like a very brief introduction to the topic here, because I think our speakers have much more to tell about the topic of our event today than I do. And then next we will have a brief discussion amongst ourselves. So maybe you can react to each other a little bit, and we can sort of link the different topics that we're talking about together. And then we will open discussion to the audience. And we would like to ask the audience to post their questions in the chat, and I will read them out. And you will also be able to have a look at them. So yes, as you probably have all read, like the description of today's panel. So we will be discussing assisted reproductive technologies, and the 3 people I've invited and who fortunately agreed to come are working, like Lucy is working on egg freezing, and Anita is working on surrogacy, and Nicola Williams is working on uterus transplants and has recently also begun to work on the artificial uterus. And in general, I mean, I would just like to very quickly say a few words about these technologies. So as most of you are probably aware, these technologies have become increasingly used in the last decades, and especially in the last couple of years. It's become more and more common to make use of assisted reproductive technologies, and technologies like artificial insemination or IVF have like been completely normalized. But the technologies we are going to talk about today are those that are a little bit more contested, which are also discussed in like from different perspectives, and are also there are quite some debates about it, especially from a feminist point of view. So on the one hand, one argument is that these technologies are very liberating, and that they are sort of helping people who were previously not able to reproduce to do so, like people who are older, people who are like live in non-normative family models and so on. But at the same time, there's also this criticism that these kinds of technologies are paternalistic and sort of also limiting in a way. And then there's also this this discussion about the fact that these technologies, due to the fact that most of them are very costly, that they are part of what has been called by Shelley Collin stratified reproduction, so that only people can afford them who actually have the financial means to make use of these technologies, and that therefore certain people are sort of supported in reproducing whilst others are discouraged from reproducing, for example, through or because of the costs. Another topic which is really, really interesting and important in this context is that some of these technologies include third persons. So this is of course true for egg donation, which we are not really talking about today, but also for surrogacy, which is the topic that Anita has worked on very extensively. Then there's also quite a bit of discussion about technologies which are seen to be not necessarily medically necessary, such as what has been termed social freezing or egg freezing, which is what Lucy works on or has worked on, and finally also the question of uterus transplants that Nicola works on, because there's of course like this which is like a huge operation and surgery, and the question that very often comes up in all of these contexts is this really necessary? Is this really something that we need and that should be done, even if it's possible to do so? Yeah, so just as a little background to the discussion today, and I would just like to invite our speakers now to give their inputs. We've decided to sort you in alphabetical order, which means that Anandita will be first, and then will be Lucy, and then Nicola, and then we will sort of be able to start discussing your inputs. So Anandita, you are invited to start.
Thank you, Anika. Thanks to the center and to Anika for this really lovely invitation. Um, I wanted to dive right into the idea of reproductive presence and futures and past and look at, reflect on the idea of uh, how time and how the way in which temporality has affected the use of technology in creating reproductive futures. Uh, the way I see these two manifest themselves in my areas, one is surrogacy and the other is, of course, the idea of postmenopausal conception or the biological clock. In case of surrogacy, I think the conversation now in contemporary global reproductive markets, quote unquote, is about the shifting landscape of gestational labor. Um, there has been a lot of work on India, there has been a lot of work on Asian markets such as Thailand. But I think the shift is now towards places like Ukraine, where Anika works. And I think the commercialization of reproductive labor has shifted from the global south to what is not particularly global north, but a disenfranchised part of the global north, to also document the shifting landscapes of in human rights and reproductive justice. So these conversations are constantly shifting. And reproductive futures in India, for instance, through Indian commercial gestational surrogates, have become fraught with questions of exploitation, global north-south traffic, and of course about what Anika mentions as stratified reproduction. So I just wanted to flag that before I went on to my ongoing research on postmenopausal conception, and I think assisted reproduction lies at the core of this manipulation of past, present, and future. And in India, specifically, assisted reproduction and assisted reproductive technologies are constantly shifting. They are shifting focus, they're shifting shape and form. They're almost uh, they are so dynamic in the way they are presented within popular discourse and the way they're consumed in the Indian amongst Indian publics and in the Indian market, that I think to study them requires constant change and focus as well. So I find assisted reproduction now in India shifting away from surrogacy, which was an overwhelming focus both in terms of academic interest and in terms of popular interest, to conversations around lifestyles and around lifestyle disorder, around how younger people are unable to have children, while older people who have been infertile for decades are able to have children. And this conversation is particularly complicated within an Indian setup because we are also talking about population politics. So how is one to think of reproduction, fertility, and assisted reproduction in a place and culture like India, where there is so much, there is an obsession about overpopulation, about having more children, and about controlling population growth. And that shift is happening at the policy level as well. It is very subtle, it is very discreet, but it is definitely there in state conversation about not in terms of how many children people are having, or if there are less children being born, or if fertility is being impacted, but in terms of who is having children. So there is a changing discourse, which is akin to a kind of eugenics where there is conversations around minorities having more children. There is a stereotyping around hyperfertility, which is in dissonance uh, with field findings where young people in their 20s are going to IVF clinics to actually access assisted reproductive technologies to have children. So one is, I mean, the fact that India remains culturally hugely complex, even for Indian academics and scholars. We are unable to map the way in which we can study the multiple cultures around assisted reproduction in India. And there is no limit to the kind of permutations and combinations that are appearing. So, in my fieldwork in North India, for instance, elderly couples are having children post menopause, and I don't know how to categorize these older people, these older women who are in their 70s. Some of them are in their late 70s, mid 70s, who are going to an IVF clinic to have um, to actually conceive children who do not belong to them in quote unquote genetically. And this brings me, I think the idea of the of reproductive past, present, and futures brings me back to the question of time and to that of kinship and family making, because at the end of the day, the end product of the whole cycle of assisted reproduction is fixated on this notion of the child as the product of the whole technology of the procedure, and as the gift, so to speak. The gift is, of course, a huge rhetoric within surrogacy, within commercial surrogacy, but the child as the aimed for goal. And to think of assisted reproduction is to again go back to, of course, Strathern, and to go back to Sarah Franklin and think of kinship and family making, and how these ideas are embedded in pursuing technologies at whatever age, but how age and aging get implicated within this discourse and within the use and the proliferation and the marketing, and of course Lucy will talk more about that, but the whole idea of the marketing of assisted reproduction itself is based on this, and it continues to be based on this idea of the ideal family of having genetic children. But as research has suggested, as research continues to suggest, genes remains this elusive idea itself. Amongst most postmenopausal couples in North India, uh, the women's eggs are not being used, and it's most likely that the elderly men are also unable to give their sperm to the entire procedure. So the child that the elderly woman is carrying and conceiving through IVF probably does not belong to her or her husband genetically, but this is part of an elaborate, uh, what I would call fiction, which is enacted by the IVF clinic and by other participants to create a sense of the future that this couple will have. And everybody is in on this fiction. I think assisted reproduction, one of the one of the most beautiful things about assisted reproduction is that it's able to sell you this fiction of genetic ties. And you don't really know. And at the end of the day, I think what is happening in cultures like India and South Asian cultures, where genes was always a very fluid idea and had a lot to do with upbringing, with socialization, with nurturing, has now shifted with the coming in of assisted reproduction to a more biomedical idea of genes, to a more Western notion of kinship and kinning, whereby genes are situated at a cellular level or in the egg or in the sperm, and it has impacted the way in which we think about who our children are. It has impacted adoption to a large extent. In India, adoption rates were always abysmal, but they've fallen now. Domestic adoption rates have gone down remarkably. Families are refusing to adopt. In South Asian cultures, accepted practice that families would adopt amongst themselves. So if there was a couple who was childless, they could seek a child from a close kin to have, to bring up, and it was accepted. It was part of the another elaborate fiction, but it was acceptable practice. That has stopped because IVF promises better options, so to speak. The interesting thing about the 20-year-olds and the 60 plus is the 60 plus is invested in the pregnancy, the 20-year-old is invested in the egg, and that remains the paradox again in how IVF is marketed to different sets of people, how different sets of people consume it. what they believe is genes, what they believe is nurturance. And again, I have to go back to surrogacy here, because surrogacy is marketed in India. It was marketed by the doctor by telling the couple that the child belongs to them because the egg is theirs, and the doctor would tell the gestational surrogate that the child does not belong to her because the egg is not hers and her role in laboring is not valuable enough. But it depends on how you read different discourses of genes and nurturance that creates this crazy world of assisted reproduction, which I think gets complicated again in mutating technologies, as Inhorn and Birnbaum Carmelli talk about how these technologies change across cultures. And I think uh, the more we read, the more we research about assisted reproduction, the more exciting the prospects seem to be in terms of how they're being culturally consumed and debated upon. And I think in India, for instance, now we're at a stage where policy level intervention has become critical in assisted reproduction. We have just passed two sets of laws, very important ones, one banning commercial surrogacy and the other one regulating assisted reproduction, where the state has entered into creating storage hubs where donated, you know, egg providers, eggs are stored, the record keeping is being made. But I'm hoping that this is the beginning of the creation of some kind of data as to how many people are using assisted reproduction in India. Numbers are huge. We just do not have access to that kind of data yet. And what drives people to it? What leads young people and elderly people to seek uh, assisted reproductive technologies, and what is the idea of the family? Is it a universal notion that drives people? Is um, is the idea of genes and genetic ties kind of universal foundation to kinship, just like incest taboo was? I wonder what it is that people think about in terms of kin making in that sense. Is there a universal truth there? But I believe there isn't. It's just how, and assisted reproductive technologies promise that kind of universal truth. But how much of that is actually true is again up for conversation and debate. I'll stop here. Just a whole lot of ideas out there, but thanks a lot. I let Lucy and Nicole speak. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Anandita. It's just, you could have talked longer. It's always such a pleasure to listen to you. But I think yes, we should give the word to Lucy now, and then we can get into the discussion a little bit later. So please, Lucy.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Anika and Sabina, for organizing all of this and inviting me. And thank you for the people in the audience for joining us today. So what I'll do is I'll just give a quick 10-minute introduction of my work, and then we can go more into varieties of reproductive futures in the discussion. I'm currently, as Anika already said, at a conference called Fertility 2023, which is organized by the British Fertility Organization. And it's very interesting to be here at the moment and see what kind of technologies are being highlighted as representing a future and as representing worthy of investment and further development. So I'm very happy to report back on that in our conversation and to respond to Anandita and Nicola as well. But for now, I'll just share my little presentation, just so that the people online may not be familiar with the work that I do. So I thought it might be helpful to give a very quick 10-minute introduction. Anika, can you see this purple thing around me? Okay, so right, so my name is Lucy van der Wiel, and as you know, I'm a lecturer at King's College, where I also direct a reproduction research cluster, and we do lots of fun events. So if you're somebody who lives in London, do let me know and come and join us. I also wrote a book about egg freezing, which I'll share a little bit about today, so you know what that's about. And the book is available for free, open access. So if you're interested in that, you can read the book, and of course you can also buy a paper copy. The book has also been made into a film, as Sabina mentioned before, and you can access that on Facebook. So I'll put that in the chat after my presentation. I have to say that the book inspired a film. It's not exactly an adaptation, and I didn't have any editorial control, so don't take my word for it. So let's talk a little bit about the gender politics of aging, which is what one of the subtitles of the book is. And I thought it was important, if we're thinking about, you know, time and futures and so on, to talk about aging. And in order to do that, we need to go back a little bit into the history. And the history that's relevant here is a history of family planning that's in part linked to a number of social developments, but also a number of technological developments, such as the introduction of the contraceptive pill, the legalization of abortion, which, as we know, is very tenuous, but played a big role in the sort of second half of the 20th century, and given women more agency and politicizing and medicalizing reproduction and the timing of childbearing. This was, of course, also linked to practices of menstrual tracking, which was popularized through the women's health movement, whether with temperature or checking cervical fluid. And of course, it has a contemporary component in digital fertility tracking. And these are just some examples of fertility planning technologies, which of course coincided with a lot of social developments, particularly women's liberation movements and women participating more in paid labor. And as that became more popular, and I'm sorry that this is right across my face, the issue that came up was the politicization of the end of the female reproductive lifespan. And that was then, there was the term of the biological clock became coined for the first time in the Washington Post by someone called Richard Cohen, who here gives a rather sexist description of a beautiful and successful woman who is still tormented by the fact that she doesn't have a child. And that's really the key issue for her in her life. And so he really poses this opposition between the timelines of paid labor and the timelines of reproductive potentiality in women as a conflict that is epitomized through the concept of the biological clock. And he describes it that this is something where liberation ends, a sort of biological limit to liberation. And this coincided with the birth in the first year. The year of the publication of this article coincides with the birth of Louise Brown, the first IVF baby. And this was followed in a political climate that's characterized by neoliberalization, neoconservatism in Thatcherite and Reagan's regimes in the UK and the US. And it is within this political context that the IVF industry started developing as a relatively privatized sector, as was part of particularly Thatcher's program to nationalize public services. And so we see the IVF and the fertility sector very much being part of that move towards more privatized healthcare, even within public healthcare contexts. Now, this is Lisa Harris. She is a gynecologist and a professor at the University of Michigan. And she's written a PhD at Harvard about the history of IVF, highlighting this aspect of the effects of the rather privatized nature of the IVF sector. And she describes that IVF was originally developed for women with blocked tubes. In fact, Louise Brown's mother, Leslie Brown, had blocked tubes. And that it later moved more towards a focus on reproductive aging. And that was the case because the women who could afford IVF treatment were not necessarily the women with blocked tubes, who are disproportionately ethnic minority women and low-income women. And the women who could afford treatment were generally women who were older and had had more time to accumulate affluence or came from more affluent backgrounds in order to be able to afford a treatment. And then, of course, if you're older, often you would need several cycles of treatment. So in this sort of for-profit sector, it leaned and developed itself more towards this indication for older fertility decline rather than the blocked tubes indication. So the issue of the biological clock continues to be relevant. And I went to another conference last year in Amsterdam called König, which was a conference about controversies in gynecology and fertility medicine. And I heard a lot of doctors who were speaking there say some variation of like women decided to delay having a child. And I think that's a really problematic notion because it suggests that women are actively trying to delay and that it is an individual decision. And I think it's very important to consider all the variations of the influence of longer education times, increased job insecurity, different relationship patterns over time in the last decades, which have led to less stable unions, a very hostile housing market in many parts of the world, a decrease in the funding of sexual health in the UK particularly. There's been a decrease of cuts of almost £1 billion in 2015, which coincides with the rise of STIs, which can lead to infertility among younger women. Of course, there's the cost of living crisis. There are new norms around self-actualization for women, which may determine when people feel ready or are interested in having a child. And then there's a variety of normative judgments alongside judgments about having children later in life, but also having children too early, or when you don't have enough money, or when you spend too much time making money, or when you don't have a partner, or when you're too picky about having a partner. So there's a whole gamut of norms to navigate in relation to childbearing timing. And then, of course, this is not just the decision of women. For heterosexual women or for women who work with non-donors, men also play a role in the timing of childbearing. So it's important to include that in the conversation, particularly given that if you're talking about the age of childbirth, men are on average 3 years older when they have their first child than women are. So older parenthood is, in that effect, more of a male problem than a female problem. And this is also linked to an idea of what aging is and how aging itself as a cultural concept is gendered. So if we look, for example, at a simple Google search of female fertility, we see that it has become almost synonymous with decline. We see graphs of decline as the major image alongside, a reproductive system. And compare that to the male fertility, which is mostly characterized by sad men, happy men, men with babies, reproductive systems, sperms, and so on, but no downward graphs, even though male fertility also decreases over time, if on a different timeline than women's. But it seems to be entirely out of the immediate cultural reference. And this is also linked to a broader gendering of aging itself. If we do another simple search for aging, we see mostly women, with the exception of Barack Obama going grey over the course of his presidency. It's women who are associated with the idea of growing older. And particularly if we search for anti-aging, very much an image of women, and particularly white women, growing older as the main group that is associated with aging and its relevance. So these sort of cultural backgrounds to aging itself should be kept in mind in discussions about fertility treatment that's aimed at reproductive aging. Now, with here we see a tank with straws that contain frozen eggs or frozen embryos or frozen sperm. And with the advent of egg freezing, we see a different way of navigating this kind of family planning that I mentioned before. With frozen eggs, you can potentially have children later in life that are genetically related with a higher chance of success compared to your own eggs in your body as you get older. And so this has created the possibility of not just family planning, but also fertility planning, not just planning when to have children, but when to have the ability and the potential to still have a genetically related child. And this question of family planning or fertility planning is something that has been quite politicized in its own right. So we see several countries that have either rejected family planning or encouraged it. So I come from the Netherlands, for example, and then we see that in the Netherlands, there was a lot of objection to it. The main concern was women should have children at an age that they're fertile, not medical risk, not religious objections, not ethical objections, but the idea that women would transcend the norm of normal reproductive aging was a major key concern. In China, you see that egg freezing still is not allowed, primarily in relation to the idea of marriage and patrilineality. The concern that women will have children on their own if they freeze their eggs on their own is something that is not considered to be acceptable, in spite of women then traveling to freeze their eggs or going to court to demand to freeze their eggs anyway. Until last year in France, women couldn't freeze their eggs either. And that's been changed a year ago. But initially, both egg freezing and IVF was not allowed for women who were either single or lesbians. So again, there had to be a man involved in order to have access to treatment. And now France is the only country in the world that actually allows, not just allows egg freezing, but pays for egg freezing for women. In China, egg freezing was also considered problematic because it would discourage women. It was a concern that women would be discouraged from having children. Whereas in Japan, the opposite logic is taking place. So here there have been schemes in which the government pays part of treatment for women in order to encourage them to freeze their eggs in the hope that more women will have children. And of course, in Israel, you have very particular population politics in which egg freezing isn't covered, but IVF is to a great extent. And with its population politics, there's a lot of encouragement of using assisted reproduction in order to increase population levels. In North America, we see that there is much more sort of the epitome of a more commercialized sector where egg freezing is encouraged as a form of female empowerment and being prepared for the future. And there is a lot of potential here that is being tapped about using egg freezing as a way of generating a new population of potential patients to go to the fertility clinic. We've seen over the last decade that year on year there's been a rise in egg freezing numbers. These are numbers for the UK. And similarly, we've seen a rise of private equity deals, both in terms of size and in terms of numbers, going into the fertility sector. And so we see a sort of parallel rise between the money going into the sector and the number of eggs being frozen. And so that's another dimension to keep in mind, particularly when we see the investments going into companies such as Prelude, which got a $200 million dollar investment a few years ago, where the investors said our biggest surprise was that women are not really aware of these fertility services, and we can make more ads to appeal to younger women, so we can expect a sizable upside in years to come, because more women will then be persuaded to freeze their eggs. We see this also in other companies, but particularly with a focus on the idea that if you do it younger, it's more effective, and if you do it younger, there will also be a longer period of having to meet the storage fees, but also an earlier encounter with the possibility of having treatment. Some companies, for example, advertise this as you'll never be more fertile than you are today. So this idea of trying to claim your fertility as early as possible is something that's very much being promoted in this more commercialized context. And if you're interested in that, you can read this article that I wrote about it. Oh yeah, so another dimension of that is the fertility benefits. So here we see the largest fertility benefits company, which entered the NASDAQ stock market a couple of years ago. And what they do is not just freeze eggs, but offer a whole patient experience for managing one's reproductive potential. And if you're interested in that, you can read this particular article. We can talk about that a little bit more. Now, lastly, I want to briefly talk about what this does to the meaning of fertility. So on the one hand, women are encouraged to anticipate infertility earlier, either by being educated about the potential loss of fertility earlier in life, or by being encouraged to test their fertility. And then whatever the outcome, it can be a pathway to treatment. So if you have a low outcome, you need to hurry up to freeze your eggs before it gets worse. And if you have a high outcome, it can be an indication to take advantage of your peak fertility now before you lose it. But also, on the other hand, besides anticipating infertility earlier, there's an encouragement to stay fertile later, which could lead to a baby with the frozen eggs, but that the frozen eggs could also lead to a second loss of fertility or a third loss of fertility by after losing your sort of the natural course of fertility in your body. You can still lose the fertility by eggs that don't work. Even further, it could be a loss of it could be a continuation of fertility beyond death. So for this young woman, for example, who was 17 from Israel, her name is Jen Aya. She was in a car accident and was brain dead, and her parents petitioned to extract the eggs from her body so they could still have grandchildren with her. So, and this is another case of a young woman who froze her eggs after a bowel cancer diagnosis and asked her mother to carry her the children being made out of her frozen eggs after her death. So it creates a whole new consideration of what fertility might mean in the face of one's mortality. And lastly, there's a distribution of fertility across the world now that these frozen eggs can be traveling. Frozen eggs are among the most expensive materials in the world when you look at value per gram, often exceeding the cost of diamonds by that metric. And we see a lot of egg banks having emerged over the last decade that have focused on using transportable tanks to move eggs across the world to either intended parents or for scientific purposes. So using eggs, particularly frozen eggs, as a way of doing scientific research, especially where fresh egg donation can be controversial. I don't have time to go into that particular case, but we can do if you're interested in that. So let me know if you are. So just to conclude, all these different variations of fertility create a much more fluid and overlapping idea of what fertility and infertility is. And this is something that is being politicized in the sense that it can become a locus of the articulation of a particular population politics or a particular gender or normative politics, but also an articulation of capitalist imperatives in the world and the ways in which women and people with ovaries imagine their own fertility can become influenced and be in dialogue with business imperatives towards growing the revenues of new and larger fertility groups. So yes, so I'd love to talk with you more about how our ideas of fertility are changing at the time, how we are remaking fertility, and how the gender politics of aging becomes relevant in your life right now and in the future, as well as in relation to some various new technologies that I haven't had the time to discuss with you, but that are currently being developed and invested in and are being under investigation. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lucy. That's a very fancy way to present with this presentation in your head in the same frame. I've never seen this before. Very nice. Thank you. So, yes, I think we'll continue with Nicola first, and then we will continue our conversation about these topics. So please, Nicola. We can't hear you yet. You're muted.
Excellent. Someone's unmuted me. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the same computer skills as Lucy, so mine is a kind of traditional PowerPoint. What I do want to say before I begin, though, is to just thank you, Anika, and to thank Sabina for inviting me to this event, and also to the other speakers whose talks I've really enjoyed so far. So today, during this presentation, I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about uterus transplants, and I thought it would be wise for me to begin by giving a little bit of a background to this procedure, because unlike egg freezing and surrogacy, it's much newer and people might not be so familiar with it. So uterus transplantation is a prospective treatment for a condition known as absolute uterine factor infertility, which affects around 1 in every 500 women worldwide, and it's an umbrella term covering infertility resulting from an absent, malformed or diseased uterus. Now, for women with AUFI, current options for parenthood include adoption or surrogacy. Uterus transplantation, therefore, would provide additional reproductive choice for women with AUFI and also genetic, gestational and social parenthood for those who desire all 3 types of parenthood. Now, for this procedure, both deceased and living donor uteruses can be used, and it is incredibly risky and incredibly expensive. So here I've provided a kind of short timeline of uterus transplantation. I'm not going to go through it all, but you're welcome to kind of look back at this later, pause and have a look. So basically, the first attempt at uterus transplantation took place in 1931 in Dresden with the case of Lily Elby. Obviously it failed, and there was rejection and death. And then the first kind of most recent attempt at uterus transplantation took place in 2000 in Saudi Arabia. And the first successful attempt at uterus transplantation took place in September 2014. So to date, nearly 150 now uterus transplants have been performed worldwide, and over 40 children have been born, and trials are being performed or planned with this procedure on all continents. There's been a rapid increase in births and procedures since 2016, and it's expected to reach clinical application within 5 years. Indeed, some teams in the USA are already offering uterus transplants outside of a clinical trial protocol. And this is something that actually I discuss in a recent paper that's in a book that I'm editing, where I talk about kind of research ethics in the context of uterus transplantation. So what I've done on this slide is I've provided a kind of a list of all of the things that are required in order for a successful uterus transplantation to occur. And as you can see, this list is incredibly long and arduous for both recipients and donors if they're living donors. So unsurprisingly, uterus transplantation raises a whole host of philosophical and ethical questions. A lot of these are very much akin to those raised by other reproductive technologies, but are often exacerbated given the extremely high costs and the extremely high risks involved in uterus transplants. So we have questions surrounding research ethics, so whether or not the way in which research is being performed is appropriate, whether or not we should be moving from clinical trials to clinical application. We have questions of priority setting, so questions about public funding, insurer funding, etc. We have questions about living versus deceased donation in this context, and that's another topic on which I've published quite a few papers. The harm to benefit ratio for recipients, whether or not uterus transplantation entrenches problematic values such as pronatalism, progestationalism, and the bionormative family. So I've coloured this in green because that's what I'm going to focus on for the next 5 to 10 minutes. We have worries about stratified access, given both the location of trials for uterus transplantation and the costs of the procedure. So we have economic worries, geographical worries, and also worries regarding gender identity. So who's going to have access to uterus transplantation? Should it be provided to trans women as well as cisgender women? There are also a lot of questions that are very interesting, which surround kind of the question of the value that we should ascribe to gestation and the extent to which gestating a child is actually valuable for women. There are worries about child welfare that are raised, and these can be in terms of kind of the physical risks of being gestated in a transplanted uterus, as well as the psychological risks. And also there are a lot of questions about the comparative value of alternatives. So how does uterus transplantation compare to things like adoption and surrogacy? And does the availability of these options cast doubt on the provision of funding for this procedure and questions like that? So given the focus of today's session and kind of this look to the future that we have, the questions that I wanted to focus on regarding uterus transplantation are whether or not uterus transplantation perpetuates and may further entrench problematic and oppressive gender roles and norms surrounding kind of parenthood and particularly motherhood. Now, this kind of critique has its basis in claims that the harms associated with infertility are primarily caused by the socio-cultural context in which reproduction takes place. So sexist, pronatalist, progestationalist, gender essentialist, and genetic essentialist values, which are often referred to as kind of pig norms. And for clarity, just in case people aren't sure exactly what these mean, I'm going to very quickly define the terms. So when I refer to pronatalist norms, I'm referring to norms which hold having children to be preferable to remaining child-free, and which often depict child rearing as a central component of the good life, viewing women as essentially or naturally mothers and seeing them and their lives as incomplete or defective if they remain childless. When I refer to progestationalist norms, I'm referring to norms which hold that gestating or giving birth to one's children is superior in one or some other aspect to alternative means of acquiring parental status, such as through adoption, step-parenthood, and or surrogacy, and which privilege parental status achieved in this manner. When I refer to gender essentialist norms, I'm referring to norms which hold that there is some property or properties that are necessary to being a woman or to being female, and the belief that experiencing or being able to experience gestation, childbirth, and parenthood are necessary components of femininity. And finally, when I refer to genetic essentialist norms, I'm referring to the norms which suggest that the parent-child relationship is one which ideally includes a close genetic relationship and affords significant weight to genetic ties and as preferable to socially constituted families, e.g. through adoption, step-parenthood, and other non-traditional family forms. So in our society, where sexist and essentialist messages regarding the nature of women as mothers or carers still prevail, and where government policies, at least in some areas, favour families and reward parenthood, where social parenthood absent genetic links such as adoption or step-parenthood is undervalued, and where gestation and childbirth is presented as a transformative experience, it's unsurprising that a lot of women view conception, gestation, and child rearing as necessary components of the good life, and conversely view infertility as seriously harmful and negative. Now, in a society absent those norms, preferences, and priorities that valorize these forms of parenthood, the desire to attain it and the extent and significance of the harms that result from thwarting it would look very different. So in moving away from pronatalism and the fetishization and geneticization of biological parenthood, many of the damaging effects of infertility would be ameliorated, perhaps even to such an extent that these harms would, in the vast majority of cases, be vastly diminished, such that many women who may consider uterus transplantation in the current social climate would be unwilling to shoulder the incredibly heavy burdens, physical, psychological, and often financial, of uterus transplantation. So insofar as we hold PEG norms to be problematic and harmful, and in service of goals to secure the equality of all persons and to accept and embrace individual difference, it is suggested that we should attempt to dismantle the social structures and practices which cause and or perpetuate these norms and values. Authors such as Mariana Lotz, however, suggest that the provision and or funding of uterus transplantation may prove incompatible with attempts to secure widespread socio-cultural change by dismantling the problematic social structures that cause the majority of harms associated with infertility. So I've got here two quotes from Lotz, which refer to kind of public funding specifically and just public support for uterus transplantation. So she says, in a context in which reproductive preferences are already significantly shaped by PEG norms, and especially where biological and genetic procreation are the most highly valued forms of procreation, state-sanctioned and state-funded practices aimed at fulfilling procreative preferences supported by those norms will inevitably evoke those norms, lend legitimacy to them, and therefore contribute intentionally or not to their entrenchment. She also suggests that this message is going to be louder in cases where the state funds procedures like uterus transplantation. So she says the state's provision and designation of a treatment as publicly fundworthy communicates a powerful venerating message regarding its importance. And the more resource and risk intensive that treatment is, the louder is the validation that the condition to be treated is weighty, serious, and regrettable. And the proposed treatment benefits are real, significant, and valuable. So here, lots of worries centre on kind of the potential expressive harms that may be produced through supporting or funding uterus transplantation. So the extent to which providing or supporting uterus transplantation may further entrench the problematic and excessive and oppressive gender roles and norms that cause harm to women with AUFI and other forms of infertility in the first place. But what then would this mean for women with absolute uterine factor infertility? So should we, for example, sacrifice the immediate interests and needs of those who are suffering right now as part of a much longer term strategy to effect attitudinal change? This, after all, seems like a very heavy and likely involuntary price to pay as part of a contribution to wider social change. But also, should we be held hostage to others' interpretations of the intentions and values that underpin our actions? Provided reasonable efforts are taken to effectively communicate the values underpinning our actions, should we be responsible for others' wrongful interpretations of those intentions? So, for example, the state and healthcare providers don't necessarily need to subscribe to problematic PEG norms to offer treatments like UTX, and instead they may see things as they are, but choose to proceed in order to protect an individual from harm or distress in a defective social situation. So a really good example to illustrate this is that of the pinoplasty, which is the pinning back of ears, often in kind of adolescent children who are being bullied for kind of having ears that stick out a little bit. Now, doctors who perform pinoplasties know that this procedure doesn't provide any physical benefits to their patients and that these benefits are only psychological. Yet they still do it in order to alleviate the suffering of their patients, whilst knowing that were society different, were children not bullied for having ears that stick out a little bit, their patient wouldn't require this surgery. So my suggestion is that provided reasonable efforts are taken to effectively communicate the values underpinning our actions, such as through explicit recognition of the social roots of many of the harms associated with infertility, the careful positioning of uterus transplantation as no more or less desirable than non-technological options, funding and participating in educative efforts designed to improve social attitudes regarding infertility and PEG norms, expressivist objections to uterus transplantation don't hold all that much weight. I do, however, want to end with a quick question. And that is kind of whether work exploring the implications of new reproductive technology should focus on kind of ground level policy issues that take social reality as it is, more or less for granted, or should we take a more visionary or revolutionary approach by focusing on fundamental social change? And this is kind of a really broad question, and it arises in so many areas of philosophy, such as organ sale, sex selection, where some scholars focus on the production of shorter term policy proposals for minimizing harm and injustice within a flawed system, while others focus on the removal of the more fundamental social structures that cause harm and injustice in the first place. And so I just kind of want to leave with the question, can we do both?
Wow, thank you, Nicola. Well, that's big That's a big question in the end. Yeah, I will probably need a bit of time to think about it, but yes, I think I would sort of just pull together some of the key issues that came up in your presentations, and maybe we can start from there. So one of the things that came up again and again was the issue of time, which I thought was really interesting. So especially Lucy and Anindita talked about this, but I think that is something that is very central to assisted reproductive technologies, this question of time. And so that was the one topic that came up that I thought would be interesting to talk about. And the second one, of course, is money. And I think all of you, and of course I and my research as well, are coming into touch with this issue of money. And I think the stuff that Lucy is doing with these like stock market, this intersection of the stock market and fertility, I think it's incredibly interesting. But also when we talk about uterus transplants, for example, and the question really, is it worth it? I mean, it sounds a little bit simple, but of course the question of like the financial costs and the health costs for the use of these kinds of technologies. So it's like it's time, it's money, and then of course the question that is sort of like a cross-cutting topic is always genetics, right? Like we have Anindita talked about this in quite a bit of detail. This idea of genetics, less than actual genetics. And of course, when we talk about freezing fertility, the issue of genetics plays a really important role, because that's why people are freezing their eggs, because they want to use their own genetic material, at least in many cases. And of course, that's also something that's really central to uterus transplant, this idea of being able to carry your own child. But this issue of gestation also comes into play there. And then the final thing, there's like two more things. So one is really this idea of heteronormativity. I think that came up also in all of your talks. And I think, Nicola, you talked about this most perhaps, but this idea of like who has access to these kinds of technologies, and how does this intersect with legal regulation and policy, for example. Lucy spoke about this as well. So that's, I think, another big sort of thematic cluster, perhaps. And finally, one thing that none of you has explicitly talked about, but which still felt like a cross-cutting topic, was this idea of genealogy. Some of you talked about kinship, but I think especially this idea of genealogy. Like if we talk, for example, about uterus transplant, at least to my knowledge, it's also often mothers who donate their uterus to their daughters, which I think is incredibly interesting when you think about the fact that there's some kind of turning upside down of genealogy when, a baby is born within the uterus, that the person has herself been gestated in, for example, how that really turns genealogy upside down. But of course, that is like genealogy is also something that's related to the biological clock that Lucy and Anindita mentioned. So these were sort of the topics that came up, and I would just like to invite you to maybe also, react to each other's presentations a little bit, so that we can really get the discussion started about these topics. Or maybe there are other issues that came up that you find, or that I haven't mentioned, that you find really interesting. So yes, I would be curious to hear from you what you think.
Well, those are a lot of different things, Anika.
I know,
I don't
sorry.
know if you want me to respond to all 4 or 5 topics, as well as the
Maybe
others.
you can also choose one if you like. This was just supposed to, like give a few clues what we could theoretically talk about.
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening so attentively and thinking along with us. I was thinking, I mean, maybe relating to some of these issues, it may be helpful to to report back a little bit from the conference at the moment and what I see happening here in terms of the questions of time and financial investment and sort of futures that are being imagined and researched at the moment. And I think it's, you know, I'm really struck so far by, and it's not something you've mentioned, Anika, I'm sorry, but by a real focus on investment in automation and digitalization, adding a lot of data-driven applications in IVF, as well as using more online platforms to mitigate between a clinic and a patient, whether that is as an insurer or just by the clinic themselves moving online, and that there's a lot of investment going into that. And I think that's an interesting development at the level of, you know, how patients' data is being managed, at the level of the embryological lab being changed at the moment and the effects that that has on the organization of labor, for example, and also on marketing and how people are being recruited, how communication happens, as well as the level of financial investment and the idea that making things more digital is going to cut costs and is going to be a way towards increased revenue and a wider reach of these services. And the reason why I bring it up is that I think with all of our topics, there is a question of scale. You know, like, does this, on the one hand, what is the scale of the people who can access the technology? And on the other hand, to what extent is it accessible to people, whether or not they access the technology, but is it something that they could afford or know about, or that their health systems would allow legally? And then on the other, and then sort of at the third tier about whether it is part of the cultural consciousness, and whether even the idea of, say, uterine transplantation or ectogenesis or surrogacy, even if it's not necessarily very accessible, may be part of how people think about what could be possible, or what, you know, what underlying concepts of fertility, gender, our bodies, our possibilities, our kinship structures are conceivable in relation to these technological changes. And so, you know, I would say that it's in sort of understanding that at that conceptual level, it's really important to look at what are the infrastructural shifts and what are the both the market and the political dimensions of making these things happen or not. And that's why I always tend to focus on that, because I feel like it often is quite invisible, but at the same time, it determines so much about what we know about, what we can access, and what we actually do access. So I think that will continue to have relevance in the future.
Thank you. And Anita, Nicola, do you also want to comment, or would you prefer that we open the floor for discussion for the participants as well? Nicola?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. So you noted that one of the key themes, like arising from our three kind of short talks, was that of timing. And actually, as you said, that it wasn't so prevalent in my talk, but actually one of the key discussions surrounding kind of the ethics of uterus transplantation has focused on inclusion and exclusion criteria for this procedure. And in order to increase success rates, they've created like very narrow windows of time in which women are able to access this technology. So there are kind of a lot of questions surrounding timing there. Obviously, with regards to money, at the moment, uterus transplantation is the most expensive assisted reproductive technology around, and the prices vastly differ depending upon the country in which it's performed. So kind of within the UK, it's anticipated that uterus transplantation will cost around kind of £50,000 per procedure. But then in the US, there have been suggestions that it's $80,000 to $120,000, which is a discrepancy even with the conversion rate. I suppose the other thing that I do want to talk about is the focus that we have all had on kind of genetic ties and the massive importance that these seem to play kind of people's views regarding reproductive technology and also regarding alternatives to reproductive technology, so adoption, foster care and childless. And I was just kind of wondering like how it might be that we can really start to unpick the norms and values that underpin these desires that so many women have, and how we might seek to undermine them.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely agree, and I think this is a question that all of us who work on assisted reproductive technologies are, continuously struggling with, because we sometimes see that, some of these procedures are quite invasive on different levels, right? And sometimes, there really is the question like whether there may be alternatives which are less invasive, perhaps. I don't know, Anandita, would you like to add something on this?
Taken in with the fantastic discussion that Lucy added and contributed to. I was thinking about how we're talking about life and future. We're also talking about the death of these women who go through these procedures, especially uterine transplantation, and fascinating to hear you, Nicola, and how death is very much part of the subtext of life. And I'm reminded about this really interesting article that Adi Bharadwaj and Marsha and Horn wrote, how the birth of that one child is through the death of multiple. It's part of the IVF process, the death of tissue and cell, and how we forget that assisted reproduction carries with it subtext of death within it. To give birth to. Thank you so much. It was really fascinating.
I mean, if I can respond to that, I think it's also important that we think about the non-human deaths that are part of this as well. I'm just making some notes, Anandita, on what you said, because we speak of this mostly in human terms, but a lot of the technologies that and sort of the trials that are being used are originate or have materials that are coming from non-human animals. So there is experimentation on animals to try, well, for example, transplantation techniques. I don't know if Nicola can elaborate on that, but also within sort of the history of IVF is linked to experimentation on animals as well, and particularly the kind of fundamental biological work on tissue culturing relies, for example, on fetal bovine serum, which is a serum that's taken out of the beating hearts of calves that are born, well, that are not really born. So if a cow is pregnant and is brought to the abattoir to be killed, and they find that her body has fetus in it, the uterus is cut out of the body and brought to a separate department, and then that calf is sort of born by opening that uterus while it's already no longer in the body of the mother cow, and then that calf, if it's in the last trimester of pregnancy, it's injected with, or there's like a big hollow needle that goes through their ribs right into the heart, and then the blood gets sucked out of that heart, and they die in that way. And because they are not officially an individual animal, they don't fall under the regulations of animal protection in terms of the regulations about how you can kill animals. So these sort of fetuses are seen as byproducts of the body of the mother. And the blood that's taken out of that is then rinsed from various, the elements in the blood, and that what remains is the serum. So if you take out the platelets and white and red blood cells, and that serum has a lot of growth factors that help cells grow, and so there's a large market in selling that serum to labs, and you'll see that in most labs that you go to, you can find it FBS, the fetal bovine serum. And so a lot of the technologies that we're talking about are using that serum, not so much in a clinical context, but in this sort of fundamental biological work that precedes that. And so I think it's important that we look at whose deaths in that sense contribute to the birth of more humans, or the potential birth of more humans, not to mention the animals that are experimented on. And so I think that these stories remain usually invisible, and I think it's really important that we trace, what materials are required for IVF, both in terms of its development and its clinical work.
Yeah, I suppose straightforwardly, like in the context of uterus transplantation, there have been numerous animal studies that have taken place. And so it began obviously with experiments in mice and rats, and then moved on to sheep, pigs, dogs, and also to primates such as baboons and macaques. And I suppose what is interesting in this context is the sheer volume of kind of animal deaths that have been required in order to produce this. One thing that really sticks in my mind is when I attended one of the first uterus transplantation conferences that was organised by Mats Brandström's team in Sweden, and one of the speakers noted that if a human participant in uterus transplantation died during these first kinds of sets of trials, it would mean the end of this procedure. And yet we have hundreds of animal deaths, and no one's questioning those.
I think these are two really interesting comments, because they also show how it's not like a merely human issue, but it's really cross-cutting between different species and really including different species. I think that's one of the topics that's very rarely covered when we talk about assisted reproductive technology. So thank you very much, Lucy and Nicola, for pointing that out, because I think that's a very important point. We have a question from the audience, which I would like to read out, and it's interesting because it also covers something that is also rarely mentioned when we talk about ARTs. And this is a question from Arushi Sahai, who asked, so thanks all for the interesting talks. I was wondering if each of the speakers could briefly comment upon how women and different participants navigate, rationalize, reconcile with the failure of these technologies, and how we can understand this possibility of failure in our theorization of reproductive risks futures. So thank you, Rushi, for the question. I don't know who of the speakers wants to go first.
I'm happy to go first.
Yes, please, Nicola. Thank you for jumping in.
So obviously there have not been all that many uterus transplants that have occurred worldwide, and therefore there's very limited information regarding how women navigate the experience of failure in this context. Although there is some research that's coming out of the US, it looks like success rates for uterus transplantation are around I think 30 to 50%, depending upon the team, and so there's a lot of failure. And really, I suppose what I want to say is that there hasn't been all that much discussion in the academic literature as of yet, and there really needs to be, because this is a very serious procedure. So
I think failure is a very important part of the entire process, and it's documented, but escapes public conversations or policy discourse. Again, ethnographies have been faithful to documenting. I think a lot of the failure is transformed into the idiom of hope that Sarah Franklin has spoken about earlier. And failures become, hurdles to, again, achieving the pregnancy, birth of the child. But failures remain essential within surrogacy. Very few talk about how when a surrogate miscarries, how it impacts her, especially in a commercially driven, high stakes arrangement where she has very little voice, where the surrogate has very little voice or agency, or how it impacts a woman who's been through multiple IVF cycles and failed, and how every failure is has a huge impact on her social standing within the family, the patriarchal. So these are conversations that are ever present, but not part of the discourse surrounding the tech or within the popular discourse, but need to be brought up again and again at a more public level.
Yes.
What Anandita said actually just reminded me of something that I did want to mention regarding failure and uterus transplantation. And that is the question of when to remove a transplanted uterus. And so there are a number of women who have been participants in uterus transplantation trials who have kind of had recurrent implantation failure and so haven't been able to conceive and or have had kind of miscarriages, etc. And a lot of these women have been very reticent to have the uterus removed, despite the fact that obviously having a transplanted uterus requires women to take immunosuppressants and therefore increases their risk of all manner of complications. And so, yeah, a lot of discussion does need to be done regarding failure in this context. I suppose another thing to mention as well is kind of the impact of failure on donors of uteruses, so the mothers and sisters of the women who receive a transplanted uterus, who donate their uteruses, and the psychological effects that might have on them.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a very important point. I think, Lucy, you just wanted to say something?
Yes, I'm sorry. Hi, I'm in a hotel and somebody knocked on the door. Hello. Yes, so failure, gosh, failure, it's like the key thing in egg freezing. So we, it depends, we see that from the studies that have been done that about 40% of the eggs that are being used, 20% of the eggs result in children. So the vast majority don't. But then also so far, only about 10% of women have returned to use their eggs. So if you multiply that by each other, there's only a tiny amount of eggs that end up being babies. It's much more common for eggs not to turn into babies in the end, but either stay in storage or not result in the outcome that is presumably desired when people thaw them. It's really interesting in that respect, as I briefly mentioned in my notes earlier, that the idea of what infertility is shifts when you have eggs in the freezer. So you can sort of lose your fertility in many different ways, whether it's the fertility that you assume you have, the fertility that you test, the fertility that you find out about by having potential pregnancies that may or may not occur, and the kind of fertility that emerges from the value ascribed to the eggs that are still in the freezer, and then the outcome of when you try to use them. So yes, a whole varieties of failures are part of that. So yes, and I think that really plays a role in the present if we assign the egg freezing procedure to the present, in the sense that the potential of failure means that you're never finished freezing your eggs, because there could be, you could always have more eggs that could lead to higher chances and less failure. So that creates a kind of moving goalpost that can be used by people and by clinics and by lenders in different ways of identifying what is the number of eggs that you need at a particular age in order to get a particular relationship to failure or the lack of failure in the future when you intend to use the eggs. Moving on to the next question, possibly about the funding of egg freezing or sperm freezing for trans people. So I live in the UK, where we have something called the postcode lottery. So the sort of fertility lottery, depending on where you live. So there's no national fertility policy in terms of what's funded by the NHS, but it depends on the local care commissioning groups that each determine at a local level what is and isn't funded. So it's hard to say at a sort of national level whether or not it's funded. It depends on where you live. There is something called NICE, which is a body that advises the NHS on what treatments to cover, but they don't have any advice on fertility preservation for trans people. And the HFEA, the regulator in the UK, does talk about the possibility of it and recommends trans people consider it if they go through a form of transitioning that could affect their fertility. But also refer back to the care commissioning groups about whether or not it will be funded. It is certainly done in the UK, although it's often considered to be problematic in the case of trans men who intend to freeze their eggs, because they will then have to inject themselves with hormones that may intensify the gender dysphoria, as well as the scans that often involve transvaginal ultrasound may be problematic for people experiencing gender dysphoria. But it is certainly done, and there are several cases of trans men who've had pregnancies either with their own eggs or otherwise. It cannot, and you write here before taking hormones. It can also be done after taking hormones, but it's advisable to do that before. But I think another thing to discuss here is also the, especially after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, is not just assisted reproduction, but avoiding reproduction. And so especially for trans people, there's often a lot of discussion about losing fertility in relation to transitioning. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily infertile. So if you do transition, there's still a risk that you might get pregnant, even if you take hormones. Obviously not if you've had a hysterectomy or an oophorectomy. So it's important to be careful about both sexual and reproductive health in spite of reduced fertility, that it doesn't mean that you're necessarily infertile when you start taking hormones, even for an extended period of time. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, but feel free to send follow-ups.
Thank you. I think the next question is for Nicola, and this is by Laura O'Donovan, who asks, I was wondering if Nicola could say a bit more about the choice between living and deceased uterus donors and how we do and should balance risk to living donors.
Yeah, so the choice between living and deceased donors in uterus transplantation is actually really complicated, because depending upon which donor you use, we have a completely different set of ethical concerns. So in the context of living donation, we have kind of balancing kind of harms to the donor who may experience quite significant physical harms, which have included some quite severe surgical complications. We also have worries about the extent to which individuals may feel manipulated or coerced into donating, so kind of threats with respect to their autonomy. But in the context of deceased donation, while we have kind of absolutely no risk of harms to the donors because they have no interests, they're deceased, we do have kind of a number of worries regarding consent to donation, specifically in cases where people sign donor cards prior to their death, which tend not to include things like uteruses. So it's very hard to figure out whether or not somebody would intend to donate a uterus prior to their deaths. But I would say that kind of all things being equal, the balance does tend to shift towards the use of deceased donors if it is merely kind of donor welfare that we're concerned about. The worry, though, is kind of the question of how much more effective a living donor might be in this context. Current research is suggesting that both are similarly efficacious, and so if that research continues, it might well be that we need to kind of discuss more seriously whether or not living donors should be used in this context. Another issue, I suppose, is it's the question of supply and demand, and so the extent to which only using uteruses obtained from deceased donors would meet demand for uteruses. And this is not obviously necessarily a problem. Like, if it turns out to be the case that the risks to living donors are too great, then we should only use deceased donors. But yeah, there are all sorts of questions, including as well questions regarding the use of increased risk donors, and whether or not this is preferable to the use of living donors. And so how we balance kind of potential harms to recipients versus potential harms to donors. But yeah, it's a really, really fascinating area of discussion. Actually, I've published 3 papers on it in Bioethics, the American Journal of Bioethics, and Bioethics again. So if you want to have a look, please do.
Thank you. I would, yeah, and please, you know, you can put your papers in the chat, Nicola. I think that Sabina has also already put some papers in the chat. I was also thinking, I mean, the interesting thing about, and this is of course the reason why I chose, you know, these 3 AITs, or like reproductive technologies, for this particular talk. I think it's also really interesting how they intersect. So, for example, I remember having a conversation with an Israeli colleague, and as you may know, that in Israel, Israel is more or less the only country which officially supports surrogacy, and where you can even have it paid for by the health system or by the health insurance company if you fulfill certain criteria. So when we talked about uterus transplants, like at a conference, we had a conversation about this. She was really surprised, and she said, like, why on earth would anybody want to do a uterus transplant if you can do surrogacy? So I think it's also really interesting to look at these, like, as an anthropologist, of course, I'm interested in these like cultural framings of these kinds of technologies, how we think about them, and also how people think about them. So I think, like, in Germany, where, you know, Freie Universität is based, I think there's like a very strong focus on the importance of gestation. So it is also interesting to see that, for example, uterus transplants have taken place in Germany, as far as I know, but surrogacy is prohibited. And where you can really see, you know, this focus on how, like, this importance of gestation. On the other hand, it was very interesting to hear this comment from this Israeli colleague. And of course, it's just an anecdote, but still to see, like, why would you do that? It's so bad for your body. You have this major surgery. You take all these drugs that, you know, prevent you from rejecting the organ. And why would you go through that when you may as well just do surrogacy? So I think that is also very interesting, how these, like, cultural contexts frame the use of these technologies. I don't know what you think about this, and also Anita, of course, since you've worked extensively on surrogacy. Nicola, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry. So there are a lot of really interesting discussions that arise regarding surrogacy and uterus transplantation. One thing to note is that the first countries that performed uterus transplantation were countries in which surrogacy was forbidden legally. And so kind of the legal prohibition on surrogacy led to kind of the development of this procedure. But interestingly, within a lot of the scientific literature surrounding uterus transplantation, there's been a lot of kind of unreflective statements regarding uterus transplantation being morally preferable to surrogacy because it reduces risks to third parties. Now, obviously, this isn't actually the case. with respect to living donation and uterus transplantation, because gestation and childbirth is actually less risky than having a hysterectomy physically, maybe not psychologically, and definitely kind of involves less burden time-wise than pregnancy itself. But yeah, there have been so many fascinating discussions, and actually one kind of idea that has taken root in the ethics literature is the suggestion that uterus transplantation might be preferable because it reduces the kind of burdens that third parties might experience through pregnancy. So it kind of allows women to shoulder the burdens of reproduction themselves rather than putting them upon others. But as I've said, I don't know if that's entirely convincing.
Anandita, I don't know, do you have any ideas?
No, I think in case of surrogacy, the whole act of gestation, and again, I bring in specifically, Anika, the cultural viewpoint. I find how interesting it is how in South Asian cultural practices, gestation remains essential because it's visible. And its visibility gives the woman the status of motherhood. So the swollen stomach is essential to gain legitimacy. And if you're not gestating, then you are going through a crisis of having a child without a visible pregnancy. So, and if you are gestating, if you are the surrogate and the child is not yours, even in India, you have to, as a surrogate, either you're hiding it, and if you're hiding it, then you have to create fictions around where the child went. So, and you have to tell your extended family or your neighborhood about how you lost the child. Maybe there was a miscarriage, or the child was given up for adoption, or either way, there is social approbation. So, if you have a child without being pregnant, you have to create a fictional pregnancy. So, I've heard of cases where women would actually have a prosthetic or some kind of an artificial swollen stomach uh, for 9 months to hide the fact that they'd hired a surrogate. Popular Hindi cinema also, I hate using the word Bollywood, but there have been multiple films on surrogacy where the storyline asks the protagonist woman to, the woman who is the adoptive mother is hiding the fact that there's a surrogate involved by wearing a cushion under her clothes. So there is, I think the act of gestation itself is so fraught. Surrogacy brings it forth. Uterus transplant brings it forth. And being an elderly woman who's pregnant brings it up in a different way because you are the subject of both derision, awe, and some kind of fear that after all, reproductive decline has not really happened. You have overturned the clock, you have done magic. So, one of the things that we keep going back to is how ARTs are also magical in the way they position themselves and sell them. The act of, it is miracle, it is a miraculous thing to happen. So, yeah, I keep grappling with these ideas, and I think some things that would be interesting in how we make sense of how the miraculous becomes part of the very rational, scientific way of.
Yeah, I think you mentioned you mentioned a term which I think is really central to all of these three cases, and this is, like you said, that it's a crisis, right? And I mean, on the one hand, I think in Lucy's example, it's more than like the creation of a crisis. I think, Lucy, you show to us like how, there's like in the beginning, there's just this offer of testing your fertility, and your fertility becomes really like problematic because it shows that every day your fertility is going to decrease. So somehow this is some form of a creation of crisis, right? And also like with surrogacy, of course, you know, there's this kind of, I mean, Marsha Inhorn has called this like a reproductive disruption, right? But it's also a form of a crisis, this idea that, you know, you cannot reproduce in ways that you maybe want. And of course, that's the same thing with uterus transplants, right? I mean, I have even done interviews with people who were planning to access surrogacy and who were born without a uterus, for example, and who only found out like in their 20s or something because they hadn't had the appropriate medical care, they were just not aware. And I think so there too, like this crisis of, you know, not having a uterus or perhaps also having had like a history of cancer or whatever, for whatever reason people access uterus transplants or want to make use of uterus transplant. There's always this idea of crisis, and at the same time the solution to that, as you also just mentioned, Anandita, this miracle of AITs, right? That and we all know these images of like elderly women. I don't like, who was it, like some celebrity in their 50s who, you know, miraculously become pregnant, and then always say like, oh, you know, like I didn't use any AITs, it just happened. And it's like, it's a miracle to me too, you know, this kind of this miraculous quality of AITs. I think that in all three examples, that's also something that plays a role. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, there is the idea of a crisis, and there's also the idea of a much slower deliberation that's also part of it. You know, at least in the case of egg freezing, I think yeah, it's true. And I did mention the fertility testing and a particular form of marketing, and definitely there is the sort of creation of a problem in order to promote a solution. But there's also I do think that many women experience competing timelines in their lives, and that these are also very slow, ongoing considerations about, you know, how do I relate to my reproductive future? How do I relate to the possibility of having children? How do I relate to my own sense of aging and the fact that when we age, our identity shifts for all of us? And it's such an interesting identity category in that way, because many of our identity categories don't shift over time, but aging is one that we all share as a dynamic one. And, you know, how do we understand ourselves and our bodies in relation to that slow and continuous shift is sort of along this fast crisis, a very slow deliberation, I think, for many people of how to navigate all these new options, which I think really distinguishes the generation. You know, I don't know exactly your ages, but I'm in my late 30s. So say my generation versus the generation of women who are now in their early 20s, who are growing up far more with the mainstream fertility testing being available to them, being marketed to them, which when I was 22, I never thought about my fertility in that particular sense, or in even having to consider whether or not I would get it tested, whether or not I would get anything frozen. That came much later for me because the technologies were introduced and became mainstream when I was older. But also comparing it to the generation of my mother, who had me in her late 30s. So, you know, for her, the timing of her childbearing was very much linked to being the first generation of women who had access to the pill and who could choose to have fewer children, and that was socially acceptable. She was the first of her generation, so the first in her line, compared to previous generations to her who could work full time, could continue working after getting married and having a child. So we see that sort of in the generations that I am a part of and that I know, there's such a big shift in how we time, to the extent that we have agency over it. Not everybody does, not in all circumstances do we have it, but to the degree that different generations of people experience their bodies and their relationship to their reproductive potential differently, I think these technologies increase the number of options that we have, the number of ways in which we may carry responsibility, and the number of ways that we can, as it were, manage it. And this idea that it is a responsibility to manage it is something that I think is new to a certain section of women and people with ovaries in the world today. And that's both a fast crisis, but also a slow deliberation and a very subtle shift in what we think is normal and acceptable and the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like an important point. And I think linked to that, we haven't talked about that, and of course we're all aware of that, but it sort of comes up again and again how highly gendered it is at the same time, you know. And you showed these images of these, like, you know, when you look for aging, you know, it's always, you know, people who are seen as females who are aging, and that there's like no talk, no discussion whatsoever that, for example, people who produce sperm are also, you know, aging, and that also maybe the quality of their gametes is, you know, going down. And if you look at like uterus transplants, or also at surrogacy, I mean, these are also like, you know, it's like really invasive when it comes to the body, right? Like the bodily experience and like what is happening with the body. Like uterus transplants, I think, is probably the most extreme form here with this like major surgery and the continuing a necessity to take medication, which, at least as far as I know, is pretty strong medication. I mean, I'm not, you know, fully into the topic, but also with surrogacy, for example. I mean, there's also like, you know, really high dosages of hormones you're taking, and then you have the whole process of gestation, which also comes with a certain risk. And I mean, the same with egg freezing, of course, too. Like you know, you have to inject hormones, you have to have the surgery to remove it and stuff. And it's a very, you know, it's a really gendered and very embodied form of like how shall I say it, like a process, right? So yeah, I don't really know what to make of it, but I think that's also why it was really interesting to have this question about trans people, because that's where, you know, these gendered norms as like sort of heteronormative ideas are challenged, and that makes it even more difficult in public discourse, but also in the medical system, to how do we deal with these kinds of things. And regarding uterus transplants, for example, for trans women, I don't know. I mean, as I said, it's not my research topic. I don't even know if there is any kind of research in that area, if it's even possible. I have no idea. I don't know. Maybe Nicola, you can answer that question.
So there has been some research that's been done kind of assessing the appetites of trans women for uterus transplantation. I mean, obviously, prior to undergoing any kind of scientific research, it's important to determine whether or not this is something that people want. And so that's been going on, and myself and a number of colleagues have published a couple of papers on perceptions and motivations in trans women underpinning uterus transplantation. But I suppose what is also interesting is that trans men as well would be a source of uteruses for transplant if they're undergoing kind of a gender affirmation surgery which removes the uterus. And while this was kind of pointed out very early on in the literature, the prospect of transplanting a uterus into a trans woman was discussed much later.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely interesting topic, because of course, or at least in many cultures, I would say that gestating and giving birth to a child is pretty much like the, you know, the central idea of being a woman. And of course, you know, that would something that would also, I don't know, give some kind of credibility to a trans woman in certain kinds of discourse.
Yeah, so a lot of trans women were interested in the prospect of gestation, but a lot of them too were merely interested in possessing the uterus and in kind of experiencing things like menstruation. Now, obviously, given the kind of risks of the procedure, it would be highly unlikely that ultimately they would weigh the benefit of being able to menstruate against kind of the risks of surgery as kind of significant enough. But there are many reasons why a trans woman might wish to have a uterus transplant, and not all of them regard kind of gestation and childbirth.
Oh, that's very interesting. That is something I wasn't really aware of. So, but Lucy, you just wanted to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering, Nicola, whether if you donate a womb or uterus versus having a hysterectomy, is it a different procedure? Like, do you need to remove the uterus in another way? And would it put more strain on the body to remove the uterus if it needs to be preserved and sort of removed in a way that it could still be transplanted versus it being removed and then it going into biowaste?
Right, so I'm not a surgeon, but I do know a little bit about this. Yeah, so essentially, it would be a total abdominal hysterectomy, but by removing kind of much longer vascular pedicles to allow for kind of better anastomosis.
Yeah.
So yes, it would be kind of a radical hysterectomy and more radical than a radical hysterectomy, and so the risks are greater. There's also, because you're removing kind of greater vascular lengths, a greater risk of kind of cutting the bladder and things like that. So yeah, the risks are much bigger.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not a simple question of you're not using the uterus anyway, so you might as well give it to someone else. It is a different kind of procedure and a different consideration. Okay, thank you for clarifying.
So we have one more question from the audience, and I think that was probably going to be the last question because we are coming to an end, but I would like to read it out. That's from Waltraud Ernst, who says, thank you for your interesting research and presentations. I would like to take up Nicola Williams' question about promoting education which reflects critically gender norms of infertility as a lack, failure, stigma, and selective pronatalism as a social or socio-technical problem, which should be tackled rather by ethical education instead of technological innovation. Maybe we need a new fin rage. I would like to share with you the book about the history of fin rage. Debiana decided knowledge as resistance. So I think this is a question for you, Nicola.
Yeah, so I think it is incredibly important for us to kind of really question the norms that underpin desires regarding parenthood in women, and kind of the norms that underpin the particular routes to parenthood that we seek to take. This, of course, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be taking the desires that these women have seriously, because they are desires that are held. Kind of when they're thwarted, they result in significant harm. And so, yes, kind of we need to focus on education, but we also need to focus on mitigating harm.